Well, howdy y'all, and welcome back to Country Fried Minis. I'm your host Cameron, the country boy in the big city, presenting to you once more from the Bullshit Corner 2.0. And today I'd like to talk to y'all about this fabulous little model in 54mm scale.
Alrighty then, let's get started on this here fabulous Dragon Summoner model in 54mm sculpted by Julie Guthrie on behalf of Reaper Miniatures. As with many of the models on offer from Reaper, this here mini is cast in white metal and is going to take a bit of prepping up before we can get started proper on the project. Once we've got the model pieces out of the package and onto the work surface, we'll take a moment to dry fit them and ensure that everything is present and accounted for. From there, we want to get out our trusty Army Painter miniature files and start going to town grinding away all them mold lines, mold slips, flashing, and any other various casting imperfections. Okie day, with the cleanup well underway and basically complete, it's already time to introduce today's guest palette, Dratini! As with all of our guest palettes here on Country Fried Minis, we're going to ask Dragonair here to hold on to some super sticky stuff so as we can get to the assembly of our lovely scantily clad lady with the Dragonites. My go-to for this purpose today is going to be some Bob Smith Industries extra thick Maxi Cure gap filling super glue. Though this here adhesive says it has a 10 to 25 second cure time, we're also going to get out our BSI Instaset cyanoacrylate curing catalyst and really accelerate the bonding process to a near instantaneous degree. We'll just take a toothpick and slobber on a bit of thickened stick all over our dragon stumps and then press the parts together until they developed a tenuous hold on each other, then dribble on a dab or two of that super glue aphrodisiac. Next up on the agenda today, we need to stuff some gaps because of the small imperfections in the sculpts here. Between the hand-sculpted nature of this design as well as the little irregularities that develop over the life of the mold, the spaces between parts often get progressively more ill-fitting when it comes to metal models. Though we can do a bit of bending and modification to have them join up more closely, we'll need a touch of the green stuff to really make those gaps less gaping and blended well into each other. I personally prefer Kneadatite for this application, also known as green stuff, because it has a real soft consistency and doesn't shrink at all when curing up. Also, a side note here, this stuff has a nice chewy texture just like some soft bubble gum, but don't be putting it in your mouth, that's gross. Anywho, just get you out a few implements like this here metal sculpting tool and some silicone soft tip putty pusher sticks, and make sure to keep everything real moist while going at the gaps. I mean it, you really need your tooltip to be absolutely drenched or it's going to get sticky all over the place, making a mess everywhere except where you need it to. Our implement dripping wet, we'll rub our semi-stiff soft tip putty pusher stick against little sausages of green crammed into the crevices of our stupid sexy dragons, and after a while of pushing and prodding, the gaps will be sealed and the requisite detail will also be as smooth as can be, not only reinforcing the joins from earlier, but effectively erasing any sign of the previously extant gaps. With our model all assembled and cured and gap filled and filed and fluffed, we'll send the pair of parts of this here project on over to the booth where we do the high-speed squirting of atomized white pre-paint, and with that, it's prime time. As always with any project that's going to involve speed paints or contrast colors, it's going to require a nice smooth coat of Stynylrez white primer built up in multiple thin passes until we've got full opacity over our metal foundations. A serious word of caution among all of this irreverence though, since this is a metal model, it's going to be much more prone to chipping as compared to a resin or plastic model. With this in mind, we want to not only get a nice solid coat on our prime job, but we also want to allow it ample time to fully cure before moving on to the steps that will follow.
Now that we've got assembly all done up, we can send this model over to the priming booth and get started on this painting project.
Our model painted in a preliminary prime job, we'll move on to the initial steps of base coating. First starting out by rehydrating our wet palette and slapping down a brand new sheet of parchment paper. I rather enjoy working off of a wet palette with these here Citadel contrast colors. They're already really liquidy, but simultaneously super intense. The little bit of moisture that's going to wick up into the paint from the spongy reservoir of moisture is going to make this paint flow really well into all the little details on this here trogdor. This here Blood Angel Red contrast color is just about perfect for the foundational tones of a fiery red-orange dragon, and it'll go on so quick with this here magic product. Further, as we wrap up the majority of the body, we can then play with the dilution a bit until it's into a more pinkish territory over the bright white base tone, which we'll use to develop a bit of tonal variety as we get onto the wings. Moving on, and thanks to our care in the brush control, we can utilize yet another contrast paint in the form of this here Gryph-hound Orange to create a bit of complementary contrasty underbelly and wing membrane-y color. I didn't mention it before, but you really want to stay inside the lines, else you'll risk staining up the parts in the wrong color. If you're following along, I hope you ain't done messed up, because if you have, you've got to paint the mistakes white all over again and start once more. Tight brush control is even more important when working with these highly mobile translucent paints. With a nice foundation of pre-shaded contrast tones applied to this heavily textured model, we can move on in for some simple dry brushing action to bring out the texture even further. We'll just get out a bit of this here James Workshop Brown Jareen and a soft makeup brush. A quick dip into our color and then a swift rub down onto a paper towel. Then we can gently stroke the surface in a gentle circular fashion until the scales stand out with a bright dusting of highlight. It's definitely better to work slowly and deliberately, building up with a soft touch until the desired finish is achieved. We can further expound upon this technique by mixing in a bit of Fire Dragon Bright, building up layers softly over the previous work. Dusting in brighter and brighter tones in a lighter and lighter fashion goes a long way to add a ton of cheap depth to a textured surface like this scaly dragon. We'll push this highlight tone all the way into pure Fire Dragon Bright, creating a very satisfying color gradient by targeting raised portions strategically. It's remarkable how effective dry brushing can be, and I can't recommend enough utilizing this technique in your painting arsenal to quickly build up fantastic color on all your textured models. Next up, we want to add some counterpoint to the highlight tones we've applied via dry brush. To achieve this, we'll get out some liquid talent in the form of some Citadel Shade Agrax Earthshade, gently slopping it in on the deeper recesses to intensify our color gradients downward into shadow layers. Ink washes are rightfully given their title of liquid talent, as they do so much heavy lifting for a paint scheme. Though they won't do the entirety of your work for you, ink washes are a great way to thoroughly enhance your painting experience. And finally, let's give another nod to that big brother of inks, contrast paint. Much as is the case for ink washing, contrast colors can really be an easy button for your paint jobs at times. Again, this isn't going to do everything for you, but it is pretty damn cool to make the application of tones with instant depth possible, well, instantly. In this case, I want to take a moment and highly recommend this specific color, Citadel's Imperial Fist. It's such an easy button for painting one of the most difficult tones out there and well worth adding to your collection. I really can't speak highly enough of this color. Wow, things are going really smoothly today here in the Bullshit Corner 2.0 on this fun little project. Let's take a moment and check in with Tom over at Flying Monkey Studios.
Good morning, Brush Monkeys. Tom from Flying Monkey Studios here, and I've got something a little different for this week's video. A little while back, Cameron from Country Fried Minis reached out to me and said he wanted to do a New Year, New Dragon project where he was painting dragons from Reaper miniatures and wanted to collaborate with me on this project, which I thought was a fantastic idea. So we started talking back and forth, and he finally settled on this figure, the Dragon Summoner from Reaper Miniatures. She's got two dragons. She's got one on her shoulder there and one behind her. And I've got it kind of held together with blue tack right now to show how it'll look when it's finally assembled. But we both got the same miniature, and we're putting our own take on it, doing our own thing with it. So I've got something kind of cool planned for this gal, and hopefully Cameron does too. So I'm going to go ahead and shut this off and get started on it. All right, see you in a bit. Bye.
Okay, enough with the contrast and ink wash easy buttons for now. We're going to get in some traditional layering of opaque tones. Today I'm going to be working with my skin tone set made available in partnership between Vallejo and WizKids, starting with 80.140 heavy skin tone. I'll layer this paint on all the skin surface of our dragon summoner, thinned down with a bit of water. It's better to do too thin coats here than end up with globby paint that's too thick and clumps up all our fantastic details. Just be patient and careful in your application, and you'll end up with a fantastic foundation upon which we can build up a great look. It really helps here to work with a fairly meaty brush. We're looking for a 1 or a 2 or a 3 brush, something with a nice sharp tip but a big fat belly. So long as your brush is nice and pointy, the big belly will hold on to a whole lot of semi-thin paint so as to avoid excessive refilling of the tool. Though it sounds a bit counterintuitive to use a bigger brush here, it'll save so much effort in the long run that it's well worth approaching it this way. Continuing with that very same process, just using different colors, we're going to pick out our ladies' bits of clothing. I do recommend using a slightly smaller brush here, something like a 1 or 2 instead of the bigger 3 round, but again the fat belly will help immensely. We're base coating her outfit with Golden Fluid Acrylics Phthalo Blue Green shade using our 2 round brush. From here, we'll move on to Vallejo 70.983 Flat Earth to base coat the sandals and straps, this time opting to step down again to a 1 round brush. The principle is the same as before, so I want to take a moment to talk a little process. When painting models that have skin, clothing, hair, armor, you name it, it's always good to remember to paint the deeper portions of the model first. That is, paint the skin, then the inner clothing, then any belts or plates, etc., and so forth. Working outward from the inside will help to avoid accidents later. This can be especially helpful in situations where models have deep spots like open visors on their helmets or clear layering on their clothing. For instance, when a model has cleavage poking out from an undershirt which is then peeking out of an overcoat. In the case of our model here, she's got a whole bunch of little straps that could very easily trip us up if we didn't paint the skin first. It may seem obvious to y'all experienced painters to remember this tip, but it is a great piece of mini painting theory to commit to your painting repertoire if it's new to you. Always work from deepest areas moving outward. It's surprisingly easy to forget this rule of thumb even as an experienced painter. I'm guilty of forgetting myself from time to time, and it's definitely landed me in trouble while working on models with deep crevices. Nothing like an errant stroke of deep flesh tone on the face plate of your Teutonic Knight because you neglected to paint the eye sockets first. Start deep and work your way ever upwards and outwards. While that dries, let's take a moment and put some of that same brown on all the toothy and horny bits on our stupid sexy dragons. It's a really useful tip to not overcomplicate a paint scheme by utilizing too many tones. In the case of this model, we're going to ground all of our brown tones in the same base color regardless of final color intention. This decision will let us tie back and unify all of our tans and browns and ensure that our overall palette isn't too overcomplicated. And speaking of browns, we're going to get back out a bit of our Agrax Earthshade Brown Wash to shade down our yellow dragon as well as to boost the separation between it and our dragon summoner. A careful yet liberal application of this color will do wonders to put false shadows in just the right spots. Just a few choice strokes will go a long way since this color is so contrasting to the bright Imperial Fist. While that ink dries, let's go ahead and prep up our next color. It's been a long time since I've used it, so let's put it in our wobbly pink vortex mixer to get it all rattled around just right, ready to pour out all over the wet palette. With our WizKids Flesh Wash ready and mixed up thoroughly, despite its long time on my shelf sitting unused, it's time to slap some of this color onto all that skin that we base coated not too long ago. Our heavy skin tone is serving as the base color for our overall paint scheme, so this wash will work to establish our Shadow 1 color. This will be plenty enough to deepen the skin's shadows, as our use of Agrax Earthshade is dark enough to create our Shadow 2 layer, leaving us with base tone and 2 layers of shading already before we start any kind of highlighting. Moving onward, we're going to reuse some of the Wild Rider Red that got left on our wet palette yesterday, still moist and ready to be used. This color will work well to set up the absolute shock of red hair that our dragon summoner has, a fiery dew to match the fire in her heart. Finally, for the last color in this step of the process, we're going to get out this here 20-year-old tube of folk art metallic Inca gold paint. I kind of chose this super bright gold color on a whim during the live stream painting sessions and was so very pleasantly surprised that it was working just fine and dandy. A true testament to the value of a well-sealing container, and a lesson that Games Workshop could really learn from. After all, there's simply no excuse for just how piss poor Games Workshop paint pots truly are.
Well, now that we've got the base coats down and that flesh wash on the model, it's time to throw her on over for some highlights and really get stuck into this project.
With everything base coated up, we're ready to dig into the proper layering and start making this model move forward from its ugly stages into slow developing detail. We'll take that original base color of Vallejo 80.140 heavy skin tone and start mixing in a little bit of 80.003 pale flesh. We'll mix this new color in a little bit at a time and ensure that it stays quite thin so we don't build up too much paint with each pass. This initial highlighting layer is going to pretty much completely cover everything we painted so far, leaving just a bit of the shadow colors among undersides of limbs and curves anywhere that shadow should fall. It helps to view our model here under stark lighting from the top down to get an idea of where to retain shadows and develop highlights. Though it's great to have a sense of artistry here in developing our highlights, it's not immediately necessary. In just following a general rule of upper facing edges and the tops of curves getting highlights, and the reverse being true for shadows, we can make a very simple mental roadmap for progress going forward. Still, if you've any experience in artistry at all, this will seem trivial knowledge. Yet, this procedure becomes simpler and simpler with every model you paint. Whether you're new to the process or an established miniature artist, this skill set sharpens with much practice and use. Perhaps the most difficult part of this paint up at this early stage isn't necessarily where to place highlights, but more so retaining tight brush control and placing highlights with precision, especially on areas of small detail like facial features, fingers, and her dainty little toesies. Moving forward, it's more of the same, pushing each layer further and further towards the highlight color and placing these highlights in smaller, more targeted locations. With each pass, the amount of paint we're laying down diminishes, getting less and less until our final highlights are simply little dots of the brightest tone on the sharpest edges or most upward facing portions of curves. Though we're not highlighting panels with sharp edges here, we can more or less follow the rule of the tops of forms getting more highlights and the undersides staying darker. After all, these are organic forms we're working on. We've got a few sections of flesh that are very obscured by straps, and there we can more or less keep those areas untouched as we put in the brightest colors. If this process is somewhat unfamiliar to you, don't worry at all. Just give it your best go and grow as you paint more miniatures. You're only going to get better with time and practice, and the only shortcut to growth is how quickly you put in the time. Who knows, maybe after 20 years of pretending you know what you're doing, you'll too choose to make some mini painting content. Winky face. Following the same procedure as the lady, we're going to get back out our same colors we used during dry brushing and start putting on some manual highlights for our stupid sexy dragon. We're going to keep this color thin so as to not undo the work we've put in with the dry brushing, but instead punch up the colors to accentuate the work we've already done. In putting on thin, translucent highlight layers, we can leave a bit of the previous work peeking through with each application. Initially, the way we're going to make this work is to reduce the surface of our highly textured dragon into simple shapes. Just do your best to imagine the Dragonite without any scaly details at all. Instead, a smooth organic form much like the summoner herself. While we're putting on highlights at these early stages, we want to keep this fairly simple and broad in the approach, not worrying about little areas of sharp highlights. That said, as we start to brighten up the highlight layers for this little dragon, we'll start to focus the highlights in targeted and sharp areas, favoring more of the tips of wing membranes or the highest scales that stand out. The most pronounced area of this detail is going to be on the face. which is made up of many small details, all of which could really stand to get individual treatment. Furthermore, as we approach pure Fire Dragon Bright, we'll put some extra attention on the face to help draw the viewer's eye to that natural focal point. Areas like the brow ridges, nostrils, and the sides of that generous maw are all great places to boost up the brightness and color for a little extra pop. Now we're going to revisit some of the leather details. This will be the first area we're highlighting up from Vallejo Flat Earth, and to make it look nice and warm, we'll choose to utilize some Citadel Baylor Brown into it. This will bring the color a bit into the yellowish or ochre realm, imparting a distinct feel to our leather. Later on, we'll see how utilizing that same brown base color ties other details together while still letting them stand out as distinct. But for now, we're just focusing on a few areas of high detail leather work. The sandals and belts are demanding of a small brush and very tight brushwork, so take your time and take a breath and trust in yourself as you work through these little details. I know that you can do it, and even if you can't quite yet, you'll definitely be able to soon. Don't be afraid to paint that model just because it's got some fine little details that seem intimidating at first. In my case here, I'm using a 000 brush and calling on decades of miniature painting experience, and it's still sloppy at best. Going back again to our golden fluid acrylics phthalo blue green tone paint, I had to do some quick thinking here to save this portion of the project. During the live stream process of painting this model up, I immediately regretted the use of this color, as it was fairly translucent and had really poor opacity while still getting some really strong staining. I definitely don't recommend going for this color on your miniatures, and I'll hopefully retain this lesson for years to come. Surely between my experience and this subsequent content talking about it, this should stick in my mind and I should be able to avoid this experience again. Anyhow, and digressing, I thought quickly and pivoted the tone of this blue into a more greenish direction. As the phthalo blue was already the green hue, I thought a bit of game color jade green might just move the color into a manageable and complementary direction. I think it's worth pointing out this thought process so as to remind you that sometimes experimentation and quick thinking are super useful to the painting process and the hobby growth that follows. All that said, and thinking of the model process again, we'll work in more and more of the jade green as we go forward in these layers, pushing the color both towards green as well as into some more solid opacity. Since we're painting on cloth, we'll focus our highlights again on sharper areas of lighting, namely on the highest ridges of cloth folds and of course on the most upper facing edges. Of particular note here are the straps that hold her top together, the butt cloth's folds, and the tops of her breasts. All of these areas will receive the brightest highlights as we go forward, and of course we'll endeavor to preserve some of the darkest blue tones right nearby to boost the contrast of the work. This high contrast and close proximity will help to lend a sense of luminosity to the fabric, very nearly giving it a shimmering appearance. Here we are again on the brown base concept once more. Building over a Vallejo flat earth base tone once more, we'll use some Vallejo 70.918 ivory to make a bright and desaturated aged wood appearance for our Dragon Lady staff. Even though this will make a distinctly different color to the leather from before, that original base color unifies the brown and simplifies the palette. A model with too many colors to focus on can become quite intense to look at. In fact, it's downright tedious to both view and paint when the color pool is too deep. This unification of base colors can be a great way to simplify not only your work, but your viewer's experience of your model. Anyhow, and digressing, we'll slowly mix in more and more ivory until the staff looks like a heavily worn and sun-bleached implement of authority. This particular stave was quite a joy to paint on. The gnarled curves of this rod provide a simple roadmap for the application of highlights and shadows. And then the little dragon carving on the head has some really great sharp details to pick out with a small brush. I personally prefer a 000 or a 20 liner. In retrospect, my only regret here was that the ivory brought the wood a bit too close to the flesh tone, kind of flattening out the palette a bit despite our efforts to unify it. I think in hindsight I should have gone for a darker wood instead of the pale tone, but again this will just serve as a lesson in my own journey of hobby growth. Perhaps going forward I'll be more mindful of contrasting tones. Finally, let's wrap this process up with some really thinned down Agrax Earthshade to push the shadows a bit deeper in a unified fashion across the model. Despite all that I mentioned about flattening out the palette, this super thin wash was a great way to really tie everything together, almost like a universal ambient occlusion. To achieve this light overall shadow, I went with a 3:1 water to ink ratio, which barely put any color at all, just a tiny bit in them deep crevices where we needed it. And while that dries, let's take a short break with this community-generated intermission. The following presentation is a CFM Network production, a subsidiary of Gaslight TV.
Hello YouTube! Today we are going to... Every time these pesky dragons, when I try to record a talking head... Again. Hello YouTube! That's it. YouTube, today we're doing pest control. Pest control requires different tools. We are ready. Shh, I found one. There it is. Oh jeez. We're chasing outside. That's one head down. Record it. It is wounded. That's it. We're done. Now we can gaslight the last one. Then it's time to relax. Well, that was some day. Ever since we got a new neighbor, these things have been a problem. Last time I checked, I do not live in Skyrim. What is this? Is she a dragon summoner or something?
Okay, back again at this layer and deal, and once again we're unifying the palette with a flat earth base color, this time mixing in some Ushtabi bone into it to build up the bony details on the horns and claws of our little dragons. This is always one of my most favorite details on models. Something about horny claw jobs always leaves a smile on my face. We'll keep it fairly simple here, building up a few layers and even hitting these parts a bit thicker than the care we've been taking so far. Since this portion of the model is not going to need as many coats, it's not as important to worry about the layers thickening things up. In fact, having some distinct stair-stepping in your color development can enhance the look of horns, teeth, and claws. You can even go so far as to paint on tiny striations to enhance the effect, but I'm not particularly interested in going so try-hard on this model today. The work we're doing is good enough and to a decently high level of detail. Busting back out our classic mixture of brown gerene and fiery orange, it's time to dip back into some dry brushing action. This time, we're looking at working up the hairdo of our little lady, using an old frayed brush instead of the big soft makeup brush. We want some tight control here instead of all over coverage. Make sure you hold on to your old brushes too as you journey through this hobby. Having a nice old brush like this is quite invaluable when you need a small and targeted bit of dry brushing. All that said, we're still going to get back to that fat and soft makeup brush once more to build up some highlights on our yellow dragon. Conversely to the targeted work on the dragon summoner's hair, we want fast and all over results. In my experience, nothing quite accomplishes this like a fat makeup brush. Between the soft bristles and the rounded shape, it just seems perfect to push around some dusty light dry brush highlights on the model. We'll work in phalanx yellow mixed with progressively more white ink to get a nice bright and pale yellow highlight on the shoulder pal. In no time flat, this all-time classic technique will have this dragon looking just right. Here we're going to get back out our ancient folk art Inca gold and hit the metallic bits once more with this paint more or less full strength, perhaps with just a bit of thinning in it. Unfortunately, metallic craft paints tend to break down with too much thinning, so it's better to paint at near full strength here. But with the base tone re-established, we'll build up a semi-opaque highlight layer by mixing in a bit of white ink into it. This will establish some solid highlights on our metallic areas, which we'll apply in a very less is more fashion. Now for a bit of fun stuff that came up during the stream. I had this here tub of the world's pinkest pink pigment powder from Culture Hustle, and it was more or less discussed that it would be funny to have our dragon lady be completely deranged with the brightest and loudest pink nails that's possible. So, to accomplish this, I got out my tub of powder, poured a little bit into an old water bottle lid, added in some Liquitex acrylic matte medium, and stirred 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 until that powder became a proper paint in suspension. From there, I dabbed some of this loud paint onto my dragon lady's fingies and toes, and now she's got some really obnoxious nails to accompany that intense look that she'll get in just a moment. Next up, we're going to paint on some eyes in a real try-hard fashion, despite my saying I wasn't going to try hard this model. I recall in my drawing classes that the scleras of one's eyes aren't actually white, so we're starting with some Ulthuan gray mixed in with that favorite 70.918 ivory from Vallejo. This mix of a near white-gray color and a warm off-white will produce a really natural look to these eyes, something subtle and easy to miss in a sea of cartoon whited eyes. And speaking of white eyes, we'll carefully white out the eyes with a really sharp brush and then utilize the flowy properties of Black Legion contrast paint to establish the pupils in the centers of those now bright scleras. I generally find that a really flowy paint or even an ink is much better for drawing on pupils as opposed to fighting against a normal acrylic paint that dries out on the tip of your brush. Our dragons are just going to get the vertical slit pupil without any color, but I wanted to add it a bit more to our fiery redhead, so I've gone back in with the tiniest touch of Citadel Warboss green to give her some smoldering green irises. Back to our guest palette and out with some extra thick super glue once more, and we're going to start up gluing this last to her included rocky base. It's really awesome that Reaper included this happy little stand that holds not only our heroine but also her companion. Anyhow, we'll once again get out a toothpick and glob the sticky stuff on where we need it and hit it with some BSI Instaset to cure it immediately. This stuff is magic and absolutely necessary when working with metal models. In fact, as a fun aside, I believe the model walking beside her is actually just the young red dragon in 28mm, changed into a wormling proper in this fun 54mm scale. It was at this time, however, that I saw the fantastic work put out by my collaborator, and I turned to the 3D printer to start making a more fabulous base. After all, when this is the competition, it really makes you want to step it up.
Alright, brush monkeys, there is our finished dragon summoner. I think the blues and her skin look really good against the autumn colors, the reds and orange, with the base and the tree. I think that really came out looking nice. I'm really happy with how this turned out.
It was really intense seeing the amount of work that Tom put into his model over there on Flying Monkey Studios, and I couldn't just leave my submission on just the included little rocky outcropping base after seeing that mini diorama effort. So it was that I set my 3D printer to chugging out an 80mm round base and started sourcing some base enhancements to really make this last something special. I even had to go on over to Epic Basing to find something, well, epic enough for this project, and I think I found just the thing. Anyhow, with that said, and in the meantime, while we let that print, let's take a moment to thank the Channel Biscuits. Now y'all know I couldn't do any of this here crazy video making stuff without the fantastic support of the Country Fried Minis biscuit community. But not these biscuits. These are the wrong kind of biscuits. Get that crap out of here. What even is this? No, I mean those piping hot and buttery Country Fried biscuits over on Patreon.
Og nå det på tide å takke våre finansiere. Først ut har vi de største giverne, som slafser i seg kjeksen vår med varm sauskjærlighet fra lommeboken, vår kjeks- og sausnivå, Tobias Fønskelin og Jernelementalet. Deretter har vi den smakfulle frokostmesterne, som finansierer oss med den perfekte smakfulle smørbrød-kombinasjonen flesk, egg og ostekjeks. Nathan Jonsson, Seismic, Peter Selleck, og til sist, vi kan ikke avslutte uten å takke vår festlig, klassiske, kjøttfylle frokostkjeks, pølsekjeksen, Ronald Cotney.
Alrighty, now that our big old 80mm round base is fully printed out, let's get to prepping and finishing up this here model. We'll need to first cut off all the support brim material carefully with a hobby blade and then file the edges smooth. Once more, we'll ask Dragonair to hold on to some super glue for us and use it to attach our little dragon lady to the base nice and firm like. We use an excess of glue to ensure that she has a really permanent bond, and then a couple taps of BSI Instaset will prevent any super glue crazing. From here, we'll spread out a bunch of Sterling Mud technical paint from Games Workshop to apply some texture to the base and build up the material around the rocky inclusion. Next up, we want to break up some chunks of cork into small bits and separate them out, ready to adhere to our base. Once arrayed and ready, we'll then pour out a whole bunch of PVA glue on Dratney so as to serve as a dipping spot for them pieces. A quick back and forth with a pair of tweezers and we'll have them chunks stuck in no time. Time to paint up this base. We'll start out by brushing on some gray Stynylrez primer onto all the chunks of cork, graying them up and making them look like stones. We've also got some cacti from Epic Basing all primed up, and we'll set to giving those a bit of contrast using a heavy wash of NULN oil. This quick dirtying down is going to be super effective as we go about giving these plants a really simplified paint job, forcing some illusory shadows into their crevices. We'll also wash down the cork in NULN oil before tossing some white scar onto my Vortex mixer and prepping for a bit of dry brushing. To really amp up the contrast we've gotten with the wash, a light dry brushing of pure white right onto the grayed out bits is going to work really well without much ado. We'll use this technique to set up the cacti for slap chopping, and while we're at it, we'll simply establish the final simple gray color on our cork, making all the once wood bits now read as stone. Having wrapped that up, we'll put out a bit of this here Daler Rowney FW Emerald Green ink and a hearty squirt of some Gossamer contrast medium, making a quick and dirty wash for all of our cacti. The ink makes for a really brilliant staining color without using much material, and our washed and dry brushed cactus pieces will take up that contrast color really well. These are fantastic candidates for slap chopping. All the little nooks and crannies and surface detailing will drink up that contrast tone and develop a very passable paint job more or less instantly. While that slap chop dries out, we can take a bit of Xandri dust and a nice soft makeup brush and start to dry brush the heck out of the ground covering. We're even okay with being a little haphazard near our models, as any spillover will just look like dust that's crept up on their legs. Multiple light passes of this color will develop a rich depth over top of that sterling mud. From here, we're taking some phalanx yellow and moot green and mixing up a vibrant green-yellow color to go back in and dry brush over our now dry slap-chopped cactus. Some gentle swipes across their textured surfaces using a ratty old brush will make swift work of these basing doodads. Finally, we'll take up some apple barrel bright magenta to color in the blooms on several of our cacti, blending in a bit of white as we go to add some rudimentary highlighting as well. Swift work and bright colors, and these cacti are ready to get glued down. And to do that gluing down, we're going to get back out our guest palette, Dragonite. A fresh puddle of super glue, our trusty tweezers, and that bottle of Miracle Instacure Catalyst, and we're ready to start affixing all these little cacti all around the circumference of this here base. Taking our time and thinking about the placement, we can form a really pleasing aesthetic that looks natural while also not crowding the model too much. As long as we avoid any kind of regular pattern, it'll look nice and organic. We'll work our way round and round and round until the job is done, only stopping when it feels just right. We've printed out a bunch of these cacti after all, and they all have a place around our trio of friends. Afterwards, we'll then take a moment to thank Dratney for their solid contribution and participation in today's hobby. Thanks, little buddy. Finally, all that's left to do is to get out our favorite golden fluid acrylics carbon black paint, thin it down and run it all around the round of this here base in a couple of solid passes, giving it a real good rimming and building up solid opacity before setting that model aside to dry, so we can then prepare to give her a good look when we move on to the grand reveal. If you like what you see here on the channel, I want y'all to consider maybe joining up as a channel member. For as little as $1 a month, you can have access to fun things like a little badge next to your name, biscuit-based emojis, as well as priority consideration for community streams events going forward. After all, it's your efforts that help us to keep this channel ad-free. In any case, I've been Cameron on behalf of Country Fried Minis. I want y'all to remember to be happy while you're painting, and of course to remember that your participation in these here videos makes me happy while I'm painting. I want y'all to take it easy, and I'll catch you next time. See you later.